In the annals of crime, few cases chill the soul as deeply as those involving the most vulnerable among us: children. The following accounts delve into the harrowing stories of 5 mothers whose actions, or inactions, led to unimaginable tragedy, shaking communities and sparking outrage across the nation. The baby roast legend, also known as the hippie babysitter or the cooked baby, involves a babysitter or sibling accidentally or intentionally cooking a baby, often due to miscommunication or intoxication. In some versions, the baby is mistakenly placed in the oven instead of a turkey. This story has been widely circulated as a cautionary tale. Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. While the urban legend is fictional, there have been real-life cases where infants were harmed in microwaves. Chapter 1. Elizabeth Renee Ott, a legend becomes reality. Because of the delicate nature of the case and the era in which it took place, there aren't many photos of Elizabeth Renee Ott. In the quiet town of New Kent, Virginia, Elizabeth Renee Ott's life seemed, at first glance, like that of any young mother. She was a 24-year-old woman, living with her 7-month-old son, Brandon, in a modest home. However, beneath the surface, Otta struggled with serious personal challenges. Diagnosed with epilepsy at an early age, Otta's condition had impacted her ability to care for herself, let alone a young child. Despite this, she tried to maintain a normal life, taking care of her baby while managing the frequent seizures that came with her illness. On the morning of June 23, 1999, Ott was alone in her home with Brandon. Her epilepsy had long been under control with medication, but the stress of motherhood, coupled with the ongoing management of her condition, often made life difficult. On this fateful morning, Ott reportedly suffered a seizure, a terrifying event that, unbeknownst to her, would change her life and the lives of those around her forever. After the seizure, Ott came to her senses, finding herself disoriented and confused. What she didn't realize at first was that during her episode she had placed her infant son inside the microwave. The scene that unfolded in the aftermath was every bit as horrifying as the act itself. When emergency responders arrived at the home, they found Brandon lifeless in the microwave, with extensive burns and blunt force trauma to his body. Ott, in a daze, had no recollection of the events. She was immediately taken to the hospital, where doctors tried to determine if a seizure had played a role in the death. But the medical examination revealed the horrifying truth. Brandon's injuries were consistent with being deliberately placed inside the microwave and exposed to intense heat. The authorities quickly moved to investigate, and the case garnered national attention. The shock was not just from the nature of the crime, but from the revelation that an urban legend had somehow crossed into real life. For years, rumors had circulated about a mythical story where a baby was placed in a microwave, but no one had ever imagined that it could happen in reality. And yet, here was Elizabeth Ott, an otherwise caring mother, it seemed, caught in an unthinkable act. At first, Otta's defense team argued that the crime was an accident, claiming that she had no memory of the incident due to the effects of her seizure. They asserted that Otta's long history of epilepsy, which had worsened in recent months, could have impaired her mental faculties during the seizure, preventing her from realizing the gravity of her actions. However, investigators were not quick to dismiss the circumstances surrounding Brandon's death. The evidence suggested that the microwave had been deliberately used to inflict harm. The child's injuries were far too severe and specific to be accidental. Detective James W. Blackwell, who was assigned to the case, noted the chilling details. The positioning of the baby and the severity of the burns indicated an intentional act. The microwave was the instrument of death, not an unfortunate mistake. As the investigation deepened, Otta was found to have had a history of mental health struggles. She had been diagnosed with depression and had suffered from the pressures of raising her son with limited support. Furthermore, it was revealed that Ota had previously been hospitalized for her mental health issues, though she had never been deemed a danger to others before. Investigators learned that Ota had been living in isolation, lacking a support network and with very little assistance from family or friends. Her boyfriend, who lived elsewhere, had only infrequent contact with her and had no idea of the struggles she was facing. This isolation appeared to have contributed to her emotional state at the time of the incident. The prosecution's case was built on the assertion that Ota's actions were not an accident. They argued that her epilepsy was not the sole cause of the tragedy, and that Ota's decision to place her child in the microwave was deliberate. In her defense, Ota's legal team argued that she was suffering from a seizure-induced episode and did not have control over her actions. They presented expert testimony about the impact of epilepsy and the psychological consequences of her condition, suggesting that Ota's mental state had been severely compromised during the seizure. The case raised difficult questions about personal responsibility and mental illness. Could Ot truly be held responsible for a crime she had no memory of? Or was this the result of an untreated medical condition that altered her perception of reality? Despite the defense's arguments, the prosecution was able to convince the jury that Ota's actions were not a simple accident. They argued that the intensity of the burns and the deliberate positioning of the child in the microwave indicated a clear intention to harm. The jury deliberated for several days before finding Ota guilty of second-degree murder. Her sentence was 20 years in prison, a term that many felt was too lenient given the circumstances, but the case highlighted the complexities of dealing with individuals who suffer from severe mental illness. Elizabeth Ote's case became a landmark in the discussion of how the criminal justice system handles individuals with mental health disorders. Some viewed her as a victim of her own condition, while others believed that regardless of her medical history, the crime could not be justified. The community in New Kent was left to pick up the pieces of a tragedy that defied comprehension. Brandon's family, too, was left to mourn the loss of a child who had barely experienced life. His death sparked a wave of discussions about the need for better mental health care and support for mothers struggling with mental illnesses. Advocates for epilepsy awareness and mental health reform used the case to push for more resources for those suffering from such conditions, hoping to prevent similar tragedies in the future. As for Ot, her fate remains tied to the question of personal responsibility versus the impact of her mental health struggles. To this day, her case serves as a haunting reminder of the complexity of human behavior and the devastating consequences of untreated mental illness. Chapter 2. China Arnold, the mother who shocked the nation. On the evening of August 30th, 2005, in the city of Dayton, Ohio, the horrific death of a child would soon make national headlines, and the name China Arnold would become synonymous with a mother's unimaginable crime. Arnold, 26 years old at the time, was living with her boyfriend, Daniel R. Arnold, and their 3 children in a modest home. Despite the outward appearance of a typical family, the tension behind closed doors had been growing, with reports of Arnold's struggles in her relationship and personal life. That night, after a heated argument with her boyfriend, Arnold allegedly became enraged and acted in a moment of uncontrollable fury. According to authorities, China Arnold made a decision that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. She placed her 28-day-old daughter, Paris Talley, into the microwave oven. The baby, who had been crying and in need of care, was exposed to the horrific and fatal effects of the microwave's heat. When police arrived at the scene, they found Paris Talley unconscious, having sustained severe burns and internal injuries. The child was rushed to the hospital, but despite all attempts to save her, she succumbed to the brutal injuries inflicted upon her by her mother. The news spread like wildfire, and the details of the crime were too shocking to comprehend. How could a mother do this to her own child? As investigators began to probe the circumstances surrounding Paris's death, they found that the scene was far more complex than it initially appeared. Arnold had tried to cover up the crime by claiming that Paris had somehow accidentally crawled into the microwave on her own, though this claim quickly fell apart under scrutiny. Investigators noticed inconsistencies in Arnold's story, and forensic evidence pointed to deliberate and intentional actions. The microwave oven, which was the instrument of Paris's death, was meticulously examined by investigators. The burns on the child's body were severe and consistent with exposure to high heat in a confined space. Medical examiners confirmed that the cause of death was blunt force trauma combined with extensive thermal injuries, consistent with having been placed inside a microwave oven and exposed to its powerful radiation. The police learned that China Arnold had a history of substance abuse, a factor that raised alarms among detectives. She had been struggling with alcohol and drug use, which could have played a significant role in her emotional instability that night. Arnold's volatile relationship with her boyfriend and her apparent anger issues were also central to the investigation. When Arnold was interviewed by police, she initially denied involvement in her daughter's death. However, after a series of intense interrogations, she eventually admitted to placing Paris in the microwave. It was a moment that stunned the investigators who had spent days piecing together the events of that night. Arnold's confession seemed to reveal a chilling motive. She had been angry and frustrated over the argument with her boyfriend, and in a fit of rage, she made the unthinkable decision to hurt her child. Authorities were horrified by the sheer malice involved in the act, and as the investigation progressed, the true extent of Arnold's emotional turmoil began to emerge. China Arnold's trial was a media spectacle, capturing the nation's attention with its shocking details and the complex questions it raised about the nature of parental violence. Arnold faced charges of aggravated murder, and the prosecution's case focused on the deliberate nature of the crime. The prosecution argued that Arnold's actions were premeditated and that she had made a conscious decision to harm her daughter out of a mixture of anger, frustration, and selfishness. Arnold's defense team, however, attempted to paint a different picture. They argued that Arnold had not meant to kill her child and that the crime was the result of a temporary lapse in judgment fueled by alcohol and drug use. Her attorneys claimed that she had not intended to cause such harm, and they suggested that she may have been in a state of mental distress at the time of the incident. The prosecution countered this argument by focusing on Arnold's past behavior and the evidence that pointed to the deliberate nature of the crime. They emphasized that the degree of injury inflicted upon Paris was not something that could be attributed to a momentary lapse in judgment. The burns on the child's body and the nature of the crime suggested an intentional act, not an accident. In a particularly emotional moment during the trial, the prosecution read aloud the testimony from forensic experts who detailed the severity of Paris's injuries, emphasizing the cruelty involved in the act. They described the burns that covered much of the baby's small body, including her head and chest, and the extent of the trauma caused by the microwave's radiation. It was clear that this was not a crime of passion. It was a calculated and horrific act of violence. On the other hand, the defense argued that Arnold's history of substance abuse and emotional trauma played a role in her behavior. They pointed to her turbulent relationship with her boyfriend, her struggles with addiction, and her personal issues as contributing factors. In their view, Arnold was not in full control of her faculties and had acted out of desperation. Despite the defense's attempts to downplay the premeditated nature of the crime, the jury was not convinced. After several days of deliberation, China Arnold was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought little comfort to Paris's family, who had lost their child in a way that most could scarcely comprehend. The case of China Arnold continued to spark heated debates about the intersections of mental illness, substance abuse, and violent crime. Many were left wondering whether Arnold's addiction and emotional instability played a pivotal role in her decision to kill her daughter, or if it was simply an act of cold-blooded rage. For Paris's family, there would never be any explanation that could make sense of such a horrific act. The loss of a child, especially in such a brutal and senseless manner, left an indelible scar on their lives. In the wake of the trial, advocates for children's rights and mental health reform pointed to the case as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities that exist within families and communities. Some argued that greater attention needed to be paid to the mental health of mothers, particularly those struggling with addiction and emotional distress. Others questioned whether society had failed to intervene sooner in Arnold's life, allowing her issues to spiral to a point where such a crime could occur. China Arnold's case remains one of the most shocking instances of maternal violence in recent history. Her story has been a cautionary tale about the fragility of human emotions, the devastating consequences of unchecked anger, and the importance of intervention in preventing tragedies like this one. The name, China Arnold, is forever etched in the collective memory, serving as a grim reminder of a mother who, in a moment of rage, crossed an unthinkable line. Chapter 3. The Tragic Case of Ka Yang, A Mother's Descent into Darkness. Ka Yang was a 30-year-old mother living in Sacramento, California, with her 4 children and husband. By outward appearances, she was an average working mom, juggling the pressures of raising children while managing a professional life as a medical office assistant. To her friends and family, she seemed to have a strong support system and a quiet suburban life. But beneath this facade lay a woman battling mental health issues, epilepsy, and the overwhelming demands of motherhood. Ka Yang's story would become one of the most disturbing and debated cases in California's criminal history. On March 17, 2011, an emergency call from Ka Yang's Sacramento home brought paramedics rushing to the scene. Inside, they found a horrifying sight. Ka Yang's 6-week-old infant daughter, Mirabelle Thao Lo, lifeless and severely burned. Yang initially told authorities that she had blacked out while holding her baby, and later awoke to find Mirabelle unresponsive near a space heater. However, investigators quickly noticed that the burns on the infant did not match Yang's story. A more chilling conclusion emerged. Mirabelle had been placed inside a microwave oven. The burns on the baby were consistent with thermal injuries caused by microwave radiation. It was revealed that Mirabelle suffered extensive internal burns while her outer skin remained mostly intact, an unmistakable indication of microwave exposure. Ka Yang was arrested 3 months later after an extensive forensic investigation. Detectives discovered inconsistencies in her story, and evidence pointed toward the microwave as the cause of Mirabelle's injuries. In court documents, it was noted that Yang's actions were deliberate. The microwave, located in the kitchen, was found to have been used at the time of the incident. The chilling timeline of events suggested that Yang placed her baby in the microwave for approximately 2 minutes. Yang later claimed she had experienced an epileptic seizure during the incident, a condition she had been diagnosed with years prior. This defense introduced a complex element to the case. Was Yang's act the result of a medical condition, or was it a conscious and intentional decision? The trial began in 2015, drawing widespread media attention for its disturbing details. Prosecutors painted a grim picture, arguing that Yang had deliberately placed her daughter in the microwave out of frustration. The defense, however, portrayed a different narrative. They pointed to Yang's history of epilepsy and possible postpartum mental health disorders, suggesting that her actions were the result of an altered state of consciousness during a seizure. Despite these arguments, the jury found Ka Yang guilty of first-degree murder and assault on a child causing death. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In a surprising turn of events, the California Court of Appeal overturned Yang's conviction in 2021, citing the improper use of expert testimony regarding her mental state. The court found that the prosecution's argument lacked sufficient evidence to prove Yang's intent beyond a reasonable doubt. The decision reignited debates surrounding postpartum disorders, the role of epilepsy in criminal cases, and how the justice system handles cases involving maternal mental health. Yang's case remains one of the most controversial examples of maternal violence in recent history. It raises troubling questions about the intersection of mental health, neurological conditions, and parenting pressures. For many, the tragedy of Mirabelle's death is a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors. Whether driven by illness, frustration, or something even deeper, Yang's actions left a permanent scar on all who knew her, and a society still struggling to comprehend the unthinkable. Chapter 4. Raquel Thompson, a tragic incident of child endangerment. On a fateful day in 2015, the city of Houston, Texas, was shaken by an incident that would captivate the nation. Raquel Thompson, a 23-year-old mother, was at the center of a tragic case involving her two young children. The events that unfolded in Thompson's home that day would highlight the dangers of leaving children unsupervised, as well as raise unsettling questions about a mother's responsibility to protect her children from harm. Raquel Thompson had been living in a modest apartment with her two children, a 3-year-old son and her 1-year-old daughter, Jazira. The family's home was described by neighbors as quiet, with no signs of any trouble or distress. However, on the morning of June 20th, 2015, an entirely different story would emerge. Thompson, who was reportedly sleeping during the time of the incident, left her children alone in their apartment without supervision. It was during this unsupervised period that her 3-year-old son, in a moment of tragic curiosity, placed his younger sister, Jazira, into the oven. The exact events leading up to Jazira's placement in the oven are unclear, but the consequences were horrifying. The child's small, fragile body was found inside the oven, suffering from severe burns. The intense heat from the oven caused burns to Jazira's skin, which were later described as life-threatening. When Thompson awoke and discovered her daughter, she immediately called 911, but it was already too late. Jazira was rushed to the hospital where she succumbed to her injuries shortly after arrival. At first, authorities were baffled by the circumstances surrounding the incident. How could a 3-year-old child have caused such harm to their sibling? The initial response from Thompson, however, suggested that the child's injuries were accidental. She told investigators that she had left the children alone for only a brief period while she slept, and had no idea how the accident had occurred. Thompson's explanation did little to satisfy the authorities, who suspected foul play and immediately began their investigation into the cause of Jazira's death. As the investigation progressed, authorities learned that Raquel Thompson had a history of neglectful behavior. Her past was marked by several instances of social services intervention, and there were allegations that she had struggled with substance abuse and mental health issues. Thompson's home had been described as unsafe for children, with no secure sleeping arrangements and an environment that posed risks to their well-being. The key piece of evidence that pointed to child endangerment came when investigators discovered that the 3-year-old boy had likely acted out of curiosity, driven by a desire to play or imitate adult behavior. He had placed his sister in the oven, likely unaware of the severe consequences of his actions. However, the fact that Thompson had left the children unsupervised in such a dangerous environment was a key factor in the case. The lack of supervision led directly to the tragic incident, and it was clear that Jazira's death could have been prevented if Thompson had not left her children alone in the first place. Medical examiners confirmed that Jazira's death was a result of severe burns caused by prolonged exposure to the oven's heat. The injuries were consistent with the child being placed in the oven intentionally. Thompson's lack of care and the failure to ensure her children's safety were critical components of the investigation. Raquel Thompson's trial was a somber and difficult affair. The case raised complex questions about parental responsibility and the consequences of neglect. While Thompson had not directly caused her daughter's injuries, her actions, or lack thereof, were considered a key factor in the tragedy. The prosecution's argument centered around the claim that Thompson's failure to supervise her children, as well as her past history of neglect and substance abuse, contributed directly to the child's death. They presented evidence that Thompson had been warned multiple times by Child Protective Services about her inability to properly care for her children. These warnings included concerns about her mental health and reports of substance abuse, both of which played a role in her neglectful behavior. In their defense, Thompson's legal team argued that the death of her daughter was an unfortunate accident, emphasizing that she had not intentionally caused harm to her child. They contended that Thompson was a mother who, despite her difficulties, never meant for such a tragic event to occur. The defense suggested that the death was a result of poor judgment and lack of supervision rather than any malicious intent. However, the jury found it difficult to overlook the numerous failures on Thompson's part. They focused on the fact that she had left her children unsupervised in a dangerous environment, and that her prior history of neglect had been well documented. The fact that Jazeera's death could have been avoided if Thompson had simply ensured her children were safe weighed heavily on the jury. After a lengthy trial, Raquel Thompson was found guilty of injury to a child by omission and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The sentence was controversial, with some arguing that it was too lenient given the child's death, while others believed that Thompson's mental health struggles should be considered in her sentencing. The tragic incident involving Jazeera Thompson became a painful reminder of the importance of parental responsibility and the dangers of leaving young children unsupervised. For Jazeera's family, the pain of losing a child in such an avoidable way was almost unbearable. The death of the 1-year-old sparked widespread discussions about child neglect, the risks of leaving children alone in unsafe environments, and the need for greater attention to vulnerable families. Raquel Thompson's case also highlighted the intersection of mental health, substance abuse, and child endangerment. Many questioned whether Thompson's struggles with her mental health and addiction had played a role in her failure to care for her children properly. Social workers and child advocacy groups used the case as a catalyst to push for better resources for at-risk mothers and families, particularly those who were dealing with substance abuse or mental health issues. While Thompson's sentence was handed down, it did little to ease the grief of Jazeera's relatives, who were left to grapple with the aftermath of a tragedy that should never have occurred. They became vocal advocates for greater awareness of child safety and the importance of supervision, particularly in homes with young children. Raquel Thompson's story remains a tragic example of how neglect and failure to provide basic care can lead to catastrophic outcomes. It also serves as a call to action, urging communities to recognize the signs of neglect and intervene before it's too late. The question of how to best support vulnerable families continues to be a challenge, but the case of Jazeera Thompson will forever stand as a reminder of the importance of protecting the most innocent among us. Chapter 5. The Glen Rose Mother, a Horrific Act Under the Influence. In 2016, the quiet town of Glen Rose, Texas, was rocked by a shocking and disturbing incident that would leave residents reeling. The crime involved a mother under the influence of drugs who subjected her young daughter to an unspeakable act. The event would unfold as an incredibly painful chapter in the ongoing conversations about substance abuse, mental health, and the tragic consequences of leaving young children vulnerable. The mother at the center of the crime was a 26-year-old woman whose identity was kept confidential for some time due to the sensitivity of the case. The family lived in a modest home in Glen Rose, a small rural town known for its close-knit community and tranquil atmosphere. Unfortunately, the events that transpired within the home would shatter that calm, exposing a dark undercurrent of neglect and dysfunction. On the morning of June 23, 2016, the mother, who had been battling substance abuse issues, was alone in the home with her 2-year-old daughter. Investigators later learned that the mother had consumed a cocktail of drugs, including methamphetamine and alcohol, which left her in an altered, impaired state. In this vulnerable condition, the mother made a decision that would forever alter the course of her life and that of her daughter. Reports suggest that in a confused and rage-fueled state, the mother placed her daughter inside the oven. The exact circumstances surrounding the act remain unclear, but authorities believe that the mother was under the influence and possibly experiencing a mental health crisis. The toddler, who had been crying and in need of care, became the victim of her mother's distorted perception of reality. The young girl suffered severe burns and life-threatening injuries, including 2nd- and 3rd-degree burns to her torso and legs. It was not until hours later that the mother came to her senses and realized the severity of what she had done. Terrified and desperate, she called 911, but by the time emergency responders arrived, the damage had already been done. The child was rushed to a nearby hospital where doctors fought to save her life, but despite their best efforts, the girl passed away from her injuries. As investigators arrived at the scene, they were faced with the aftermath of a horrific crime. The small home had been filled with the overwhelming scent of methamphetamine, and traces of drugs and alcohol were found throughout the premises. The mother, who was incoherent and visibly impaired, was immediately detained by law enforcement. She was unable to fully comprehend the gravity of her actions, which only further fueled concerns about her mental state at the time of the incident. The investigation began with questions about how such a terrible act could occur in a seemingly quiet home. Early evidence pointed to the mother's substance abuse as a central factor. While she had a history of drug use, it was clear that the combination of drugs and alcohol had left her in a dangerously altered mental state. As the investigation continued, it was revealed that the mother had a history of erratic behavior and had been struggling with severe addiction issues for several years. She had been in and out of rehab programs, but her substance abuse problems persisted. Witnesses testified that her daughter had shown signs of neglect in the months leading up to the incident, with reports of the child being frequently left unsupervised and in unsafe conditions. The mother had also been in a tumultuous relationship, which compounded her emotional and mental struggles. Forensic evidence supported the theory that the child's injuries were not accidental. The burns on the toddler's body were consistent with exposure to the inside of an oven, and medical examiners confirmed that the injuries were severe enough to cause immediate and irreversible harm. The mother's drug-induced state was deemed to be a significant factor in the act, but investigators also looked into the possibility of underlying mental health issues. The community was left in shock and disbelief as more details of the crime emerged. How could a mother, under the influence of drugs, commit such a brutal act? And why was the child left in such a vulnerable position in the first place? These were questions that haunted the investigation and, ultimately, the trial that would follow. The trial of the Glen Rose mother became a focal point for the community, with many asking difficult questions about the effects of substance abuse, the responsibilities of parents, and the impact of mental health crises on decision-making. The prosecution argued that the mother, while under the influence of drugs and alcohol, had made a deliberate and reckless decision to harm her child. They focused on the fact that the mother's drug use and emotional instability had led directly to the tragic death of her daughter. The prosecution's case was built around the evidence that the mother's actions had been premeditated to some extent. While there was no direct evidence that she had intended to kill her daughter, the nature of the child's injuries suggested that the act was not a spur-of-the-moment decision, but rather a result of the mother's distorted and violent thinking while under the influence. Medical experts testified that the burns on the child's body were consistent with prolonged exposure to the heat of the oven, further supporting the theory that the act had been deliberate. The defense team, on the other hand, argued that the mother's impaired mental state should mitigate her responsibility. They painted a picture of a woman who had been struggling with a deep addiction to drugs and alcohol and was unable to fully comprehend the consequences of her actions. They claimed that her substance abuse, combined with possible mental health disorders, had clouded her judgment and led to the tragic incident. The defense tried to show that while the mother was responsible for her actions, she had been in a state of confusion and desperation at the time of the crime. Ultimately, the jury found the mother guilty of child abuse, resulting in death. The fact that she had been under the influence of drugs at the time of the incident did not absolve her of responsibility, but it was taken into consideration during sentencing. The judge sentenced her to 25 years in prison, a sentence that was seen as a reflection of both the severity of the crime and the understanding of her struggles with addiction. The case of the Glenrose mother sparked widespread discussions about the relationship between substance abuse and violent behavior. While some argued that the mother should be held fully accountable for her actions, others emphasized the need for greater attention to addiction and mental health issues that contribute to crimes like this. Many expressed concern that the lack of intervention in the mother's life, despite her history of substance abuse, played a role in the tragedy. For the community in Glenrose, the incident was a bitter reminder of the dangers of drug abuse and the devastating consequences it can have on families. The mother's actions and the life of her innocent child were irrevocably altered in a matter of moments, and the scars left by the tragedy would linger for years to come. The case also led to increased awareness about child safety and the dangers of neglect in households where drug abuse is present. Advocates for children's rights pushed for stronger measures to protect children from the consequences of parental addiction, and urged communities to provide better resources for families in crisis. While the mother's prison sentence was met with mixed reactions, there was a shared understanding that the tragedy could have been avoided had there been more support for the mother earlier in her life. Her story became one of warning, a reminder of the devastating intersection of addiction, neglect, and violence. Conclusion: Lessons from the Abyss. These cases are haunting reminders of the fragility of childhood and the destructive power of neglect, rage, and mental illness. They raise unsettling questions about the role of society in preventing such tragedies and the responsibility of parents to protect their children at all costs. While these mothers were tried and convicted for their crimes, the real victims were the innocent children whose lives were cut short or irrevocably altered. The scars left by these incidents are deep and wide-ranging, affecting families, communities, and the justice system alike. They remind us all of the importance of vigilance and intervention in protecting the most vulnerable members of society. Subscribe to Mystery Minds for more chilling stories.